My next guest is the former Republican congressman for the 15th District of Pennsylvania, a state that was on everyone's mind as they watched the election results come in. I met him on the train, on the Amtrak one day. He sat next to me. I didn't know who he was as many years ago. He was worked his way the entire way from D.C. Up to Pennsylvania. And I just said, you look really important and you're working really hard. And I was amazed he was a congressman. That's just a joke. But he is now a senior policy advisor at DLA Piper, where he provides strategic advice and counsel to clients at the federal, state, local levels. Charlie Dent, great to see you. I don't know if you remember that day when I met you. I was somewhat rude. I kept saying, who are you and why are you working so hard? But it's great to see you, Charlie.
Great to see you, Steve. I remember that day too. I always said I killed a tree every day on the train. I would bring all my Hills and roll calls and Politicos and, the Post and the Journal, and I'd read it all. And that was my trip from DC to Wilmington and sometimes to Philadelphia.
Yeah, well, that was great. Well, listen, Charlie, I want to ask you again, as you kind of look at this election, and again, what insights do you have about what voters did? That's number one. Number two is, what's on their dashboard? What do they want from Congress? What do they want from their leaders that they've just voted for? What's on their priority roster?
Yeah, good question, Steve. I think voters are a lot smarter than they're given credit for at times by various people in the media. Look, I think this election, in many respects, it was a rejection of Donald Trump and a rejection of the left wing of the Democratic Party. Because what I've observed is that there were a lot of people, I'll say swing voting Republicans and maybe Republican leaning independents, a significant number of them, voted for Joe Biden or declined to vote for president, and then turned around and voted a straight Republican down ballot. And how else do you explain that these down ballot Republicans did much better than did Donald Trump in many states? And I could start pointing out races. I won't go through all the races, but where this happened, where people voted for Biden and then voted for the Republican candidate, either for Senate or for the House of Representatives. So I think there's a bit of a message here that voters, who did not like Trump, who said, I can't deal with more of this narcissism, this lack of impulse control, all these crazy things that would come out of the White House every day. They said, I can't deal with that anymore. Joe Biden's acceptable, but I'm afraid of his base, elements of his base who want to defund the police or Medicare for all or, pack the court, DC statehood. I can go on to a number of things that scared them. It wasn't in their economic interest. So I think that's what happened. So they wanted to put a check on Joe Biden while accepting Joe Biden and rejecting Donald Trump.
Oh, so I'm going to run the risk of offending you right now, which I worry about, in the sense I'm going to ask you, about cookie cutter Republicans and cookie cutter Democrats. Sure. You're not a cookie cutter Republican. I mean, you're not. Right. And what you're saying, I think, is very important, is that people are thinking about this and they are splitting tickets or coming along. And I'm just wondering, have we entered a kind of caricature, period where people, when they're a predictable Democrat or a predictable Republican on the Supreme Court or as a governor or as a member of Congress, that's just not the way forward? And I guess I'm going to try and compliment you by saying you don't seem to be that. You are a pragmatic deal maker. And I'm just interested in whether there's a tension out there when you're a member of Congress. Do you have to play by a scorecard to be a genuine Republican, or the same on the Democrat side?
Well, yeah, I think there's think about the world before Donald Trump came on the scene politically. I always said in the Republican Party, we always had what I called the self-designated chiefs of the Republican purity police. These are the folks who were trying to enforce some kind of ideological conformity, wanted you to be doctrinaire. So think, there was a stereotype about Republican primary voters. Think like Ted Cruz, pro-life, pro-gun, anti-tax. I mean, all that. And those folks, were, always then calling people like me a rhino or a squish because I was supportive of LGBT rights or pro-choice on abortion. I mean, so we were always dealing, with those folks who were, calling those of us who weren't doctrinaire enough rhino. So then here comes Donald Trump. And I think we can all agree on one thing. Whether you like Donald Trump or not, we can all agree that he is not an ideologue and he is not doctrinaire. He is very transactional, with the exception of two issues, immigration and trade. Immigration, he's a restrictionist. Trade, he's a protectionist. But other than that, he's pretty much transactional. And so he Donald Trump flummoxed those self-designated chiefs of the purity police and made it all about himself. and so that's kind of where we are now. And the litmus test really became, are you with the president or are you not? And that's not a very healthy place for the party to be. So I can make a very strong case that maybe what's happened in the election is that the Republican voters, they rejected, Trump was rejected, but maybe not the party, at least by enough voters. And by the way, there are a lot of Republican voters and Democratic voters who are kind of in their lane and they're voting straight party. But I don't know what that number is. And there's going to be an after action analysis here of how many of those swing voters. It was an impactful number. I don't know how many, because I've never seen anything like this, where they're usually the top of the ticket has some kind of a down ballot effect. It was the reverse, actually. The down ballot did better than the top of the ticket on the Republican side. Go figure. And a lot of Democrats, by the way, I've noticed, did not underperform Joe Biden.
It's fascinating. You are a person who's showing up a lot on the lists of potential appointees that a Joe Biden cabinet might look to. Maybe the head of VA, maybe a variety of other jobs out there. Would you consider going to do something like that, or do you want to be part of the GOP reformulation committee to take the party a new direction?
Well, it's interesting. I've seen my name floated out there too. I actually like being out in the private sector. As you know, Steve, you may know, I ran for office 13 times in my life. I'm 13-0, as my friend Tom Davis would say, and I'm undefeated and unindicted. And I'd like to keep it that way. But I really have no plans of re-entering government. I really don't. I mean, we have open Senate race and an open governor's race in Pennsylvania too. I'm really not at the point where I'm really thinking about going back into government. So I think at this point, probably trying to help the party get to a better place. And I have some thoughts about what it should look like. And we can talk about that if you like, what I think it should look like going forward.
Well, I would like to, but let me ask you one question real quick. We don't have much time, unfortunately, but something I don't often get a chance to talk about. One of the things we're now going to have the oldest president of the United States who was elected, at that age. And it just, I'm just very aware that I see a lot of ageism out in American society, a lot of neglect of the elder community, whether people want to admit it or not. People are living longer, maybe until COVID, but we're living longer, more vibrant lives. Do you think that there's a policy part of this picture that we haven't looked at in terms of how to deal with the fact that we're checking people out through retirement, through other things earlier? We're discounting. We're kind of beginning. It's like a stock. We're discounting the stock earlier than we should. And I'm just interested in your perspective on whether we may need to adjust somehow our view of how we look at older Americans.
I think you're on to something, Steve. I think a lot of people who are over 50 or over 60, they start thinking about their mortality. And things like long-term care become really important issues to them. I think many, too, feel like they can be underutilized. Maybe many are going into retirement without the level of financial security or stability that they think they need. And so many of our more mature citizens I think, do have a certain amount of anxiety. And of course, politically, they're also looking at how the country has changed for many of them, from what it looked like when they were younger. That's probably just normal for any older person of any generation going back. They always look and kind of sometimes they have a harder time, managing or accepting some of the changes that are happening beneath them. But I do think we have to speak to older voters more differently than we have in the past. I think they want to be more engaged, candidly, and that they don't want to be put out the pasture. They want to remain vigorous, and I think that's a challenge for them. And of course, in an era of COVID, there's even greater anxiety. I'm dealing with my own mother's 91 and not in good health, and I haven't been able to. I only can visit her when she goes into the hospital. I can't visit her in the assisted living. It's the kind of life we live right now, and I think I can see the stress on her and others who are in a similar situation.
Well, I think, Charlie, I got Congressman Richard Neal, your former colleague, chair of the House Ways and Means Committee, so give me a good question to ask him.
What's going to happen on the tax front? Rich is a good friend. What's going to happen on the tax front in the new year? He's Ways and Means guy. Yeah, ask him about taxes and trade, because that's his jurisdiction. And I'm curious to see how they're going to handle China, the Biden administration, Democrats, how they'll be different than Trump.
Well, Charlie Dent, former Congressman, Pennsylvania, good friend. I really appreciate your thoughtful take on not only the political inflection point we're at, but how, from an older, as you said, our more mature Americans' perspective, some of these issues were looked at. Thanks so much. I hope you'll come back and join us again.
Absolutely. Thank you, Steve. Great to be with you. See you on the train.